Here's a question nobody thinks to ask until it's already been answered for them by a bottle of wine sitting on a kitchen counter. How did humans figure out that if you leave certain foods alone for long enough, in exactly the wrong right conditions, they turn into something that makes you dizzy, giddy, and occasionally willing to dance in front of strangers? The honest answer involves rotting fruit, a handful of accidents nobody was trying to have, several species of wild yeast that were doing this long before humans showed up to take credit, and a discovery so useful that it may have shaped human social behavior for tens of thousands of years before anyone understood a single thing about the chemistry behind it. So let's actually walk through it. Not the polished version where some genius in a lab coat invents beer, the real version, which is messier, older, and considerably stranger than that. Let's start with the point that changes everything about how you should think about this topic. Humans did not invent fermentation. Fermentation invented itself roughly a billion years before humans existed as a metabolic strategy used by single-celled organisms to extract energy from sugar without needing oxygen to do it. Yeast, specifically the wild strains that float around on the skins of fruit, in tree sap, and in the soil, have been fermenting sugar into alcohol and carbon dioxide since long before there was anything on Earth with a mouth to drink the result. Humans didn't create this process. Humans just showed up late to a party that nature had already been throwing for hundreds of millions of years and eventually figured out how to crash it on purpose. So what did that first encounter actually look like? Almost certainly it looked like rotting fruit. Overripe fruit that has fallen from a tree and sat on the ground for a few days in warm weather is an ideal environment for wild yeast. The sugar content is high, the skin is broken enough for yeast to get in, and the ambient temperature does the rest. Within a day or two, that fruit isn't just decomposing in a generic sense. It's actively fermenting, converting its own sugars into ethanol as a byproduct of yeast metabolism. The result is fruit that smells sharp, tastes slightly fizzy, and contains a modest but real amount of alcohol. This isn't a hypothetical. This happens constantly, right now, in forests all over the planet, without any human involvement whatsoever. And here's the detail that makes the whole story worth taking seriously. Humans were almost certainly not the first primates to notice. There's a genuinely compelling body of research suggesting that many fruit-eating animals, including several primate species, deliberately seek out fermented fruit specifically because of its alcohol content. Researchers studying primate behavior have documented chimpanzees and other forest animals consuming naturally fermented fruit with what looks a lot like preference rather than accident. There's a scientific idea called the drunken monkey hypothesis, proposed by biologist Robert Dudley, which argues that the ancestors of modern primates, including our own evolutionary line, developed a genetic sensitivity to the smell and taste of ethanol specifically because it functioned as a reliable signal of ripe, calorie-dense fruit. In other words, our attraction to alcohol might not be some unfortunate modern vice bolted onto an otherwise clean biological system. It might be millions of years old, wired into us for a reason that had nothing to do with getting drunk and everything to do with finding food efficiently in a competitive forest environment. This matters because it reframes the entire question. We're not asking how humans invented something totally foreign to biology. We're asking how humans took a pre-existing evolutionary attraction, one shared with other primates, and turned it into a deliberate, repeatable, cultural technology. So let's get to the actual moment where that shift happened, or at least the earliest version of it we have solid evidence for. Archaeological evidence for deliberate fermentation goes back further than most people assume. Residue analysis on pottery fragments from Jiahu in China, dating to roughly 7000 BCE, has revealed chemical signatures consistent with a fermented beverage made from rice, honey, and fruit. That's genuinely ancient, and it's not an isolated case. Similar residue evidence from sites in the Zagros Mountains, in what's now Iran, points to fermented grape beverages dating back to around 5400 BCE. And there's a broader pattern worth noticing here. Fermentation evidence keeps showing up early, independently, in multiple unrelated regions using whatever local ingredients happened to be available. Rice and fruit in China, grapes in the Zagros region, barley in Mesopotamia. This wasn't one clever group figuring it out and spreading the idea outward. This looks like the kind of discovery that gets made over and over again independently anywhere humans had access to sugar-rich plant material and left it sitting around a little too long. And that's really the key insight for understanding how this discovery actually happened. It didn't require deliberate invention in the way that, say, metalworking did. It required almost the opposite. It required not intervening, early humans storing gathered fruit, grain, or honey in containers, whether that meant a hollowed gourd, a woven basket, or a simple clay vessel, would have occasionally left that stored food alone long enough in warm enough conditions for wild yeast to do exactly what wild yeast does. The container would have started producing gas, developing a sharp smell, and eventually yielding a liquid or pulpy substance that, when consumed, produced a noticeably different feeling than the same food would have produced before fermentation set in. Now, here's where it gets genuinely interesting, because this accidental discovery would have happened repeatedly, and the human response to it would have mattered enormously. Someone, at some point, tasted the spoiled batch instead of throwing it out. That single decision, made independently by countless individuals across countless separate human populations over thousands of years, is the actual hinge point of this entire story. And the fact that people kept making that same choice, kept drinking the weird bubbly stuff instead of discarding it, tells you something important about how it must have felt. It wasn't neutral. It was noticeably pleasant, or at minimum, noticeably interesting enough to be worth repeating. Let's talk about why, because the biology here is worth understanding properly. Alcohol, in the form produced by fermentation, is a psychoactive compound that affects the central nervous system by enhancing the activity of a neurotransmitter called GABA, which produces a calming, inhibition-lowering effect while also triggering dopamine release in reward pathways in the brain. In small quantities, which is almost certainly all early fermented beverages would have contained, given how uncontrolled the process was, this produces mild relaxation, reduced anxiety, and an overall pleasant mood shift. It's genuinely not a mystery why humans, once they discovered this effect, would want to reproduce it deliberately. But there's a second layer to this that gets far less attention than it deserves, and it might actually be more important than the pleasant buzz itself. Fermentation makes food safer. This is a detail that tends to get lost in the story because modern audiences associate fermentation almost exclusively with alcohol and flavor, not with survival. But in a world without refrigeration, without reliable clean water, and without any modern understanding of pathogens, fermentation was doing something quietly essential in the background. The fermentation process itself, through the production of alcohol and, in other fermented foods, through the production of lactic acid, creates an environment that's hostile to many of the harmful bacteria that would otherwise cause food poisoning or spoilage-related illness. This means fermented beverages and fermented foods were, in a very real, practical sense, safer to consume than untreated water or unprocessed food sitting around an ambient temperature for days. Some historians and researchers have specifically argued that early fermented beverages functioned as a genuine public health tool long before germ theory existed, providing populations with a reliably drinkable liquid in environments where the local water supply carried a real risk of dysentery, cholera, and other waterborne illness. Beer, in particular, going through a boiling stage during production in many traditional brewing methods, would have killed off a significant portion of waterborne pathogens before fermentation even began, then continued to suppress bacterial growth throughout the fermentation and storage process afterward. This reframes fermented beverages as something considerably more consequential than a recreational discovery. In many ancient societies, beer and similar fermented drinks weren't a luxury item consumed occasionally for enjoyment. They were a dietary staple consumed daily by entire populations, including children in some documented historical contexts, specifically because the alternative, untreated local water, carried genuine and immediate health risks that fermented alternatives did not. Ancient Mesopotamia provides some of the clearest evidence for just how central this became to daily life. Cuneiform tablets from Sumerian civilization, dating back roughly 5,000 years, contain detailed references to beer production, including what's often cited as the earliest known beer recipe, embedded within a hymn dedicated to Ninkasi, the Sumerian goddess of beer. This wasn't a marginal cultural footnote. Beer in Sumerian society functioned as currency in some contexts, as a component of worker rations at major construction projects, and as a dietary staple consumed by essentially the entire population on a regular basis. Workers building major structures were sometimes paid partially in beer rations, a detail that tells you how deeply integrated this beverage had become into the basic economic and nutritional structure of one of the earliest complex civilizations on Earth. Egypt tells a remarkably similar story. Beer production in ancient Egypt was widespread, well documented in tomb paintings and written records, and appears to have been consumed across essentially every level of society, from laborers to pharaohs. Archaeological evidence, including large-scale brewing facilities discovered near major construction sites, suggests that beer production in ancient Egypt operated at genuinely industrial scale, producing enough fermented beverage to serve as a primary dietary component for large workforces engaged in major state projects. This raises a genuinely interesting question about causation that historians and archaeologists have debated seriously. Did agriculture come first, creating surplus grain that then got fermented into beer as a secondary use of that surplus? Or did the desire to reliably produce fermented beverages actually help drive the initial domestication of grain crops in the first place? This is sometimes called the beer before bread hypothesis. And while it remains genuinely contested rather than settled, the fact that it's a serious scholarly debate at all tells you something important. Fermentation wasn't a minor cultural footnote tacked onto agricultural civilization after the fact. Some researchers argue it may have been one of the actual driving motivations behind why humans started deliberately cultivating grain crops in the first place, rather than simply gathering what grew wild. Let's also talk about mead, because honey fermentation likely represents one of the very earliest deliberate fermented beverages humans produced, potentially even predating grain-based beer in some regions. Honey, when diluted with water, contains exactly the conditions wild yeast needs to ferment: sugar content, moisture, and warmth. Unlike grain, which requires processing, cooking, and malting before it becomes fermentable, honey arrives essentially ready to ferment on its own, provided it gets exposed to water and airborne yeast. This makes mead production, in principle, one of the simplest possible fermented beverages to stumble into completely by accident, without any deliberate preparation at all. A container of honey left with rainwater mixed in, forgotten for a period of days or weeks in warm conditions, would ferment on its own with essentially no human intervention required beyond simply not noticing it in time. Now let's turn to a completely different fermentation pathway, because alcohol wasn't the only outcome humans stumbled into. Lactic acid fermentation, produced by different microorganisms than the yeast responsible for alcohol, transforms food in a completely different direction, producing sour, tangy, and often longer-lasting preserved foods rather than intoxicating beverages. This is the process behind foods like fermented dairy products, pickled vegetables, and fermented fish products that show up independently across essentially every major world region with access to the right raw ingredients. Dairy fermentation specifically presents a fascinating case, because many early human populations were lactose intolerant as adults, unable to properly digest the sugar in raw milk. Fermentation, through the action of specific bacteria, breaks down much of that lactose before consumption, meaning fermented dairy products like early forms of yogurt and cheese would have been considerably more digestible to lactose-intolerant populations than raw milk itself. Some researchers have proposed that widespread dairy fermentation across pastoral societies may have actually reduced the evolutionary pressure toward lactase persistence, the genetic trait allowing adults to digest milk. In some populations, precisely because fermentation had already solved the digestibility problem through food processing rather than requiring a genetic adaptation. There's also a detail worth appreciating about how fermentation would have spread once it was discovered, because unlike some ancient technologies that required specific rare materials or specialized tools, fermentation required almost nothing beyond a container and patience. Once a population discovered that leaving grain, fruit, honey, or milk under the right conditions produced something worth drinking or eating, that knowledge could spread through simple observation, imitation, and oral instruction without needing any specialized equipment beyond whatever storage vessels a given culture already used for other purposes. This likely explains why fermentation shows up independently, again and again, across cultures with no direct contact with one another, using whatever local ingredients happened to be available. Rice wine in East Asia, grape wine in the Near East and Mediterranean, pulque made from fermented agave sap in Mesoamerica, chicha made from fermented maize in South America. kumis, made from fermented mare's milk, among steppe pastoralist cultures in Central Asia. Each of these developed independently, using local raw materials, arriving at broadly similar outcomes through the same basic underlying microbial process. There's one more layer to this story worth examining before pulling everything together, and it concerns the social function. Fermented beverages appear to have served almost universally across nearly every culture that developed them. Shared consumption of fermented beverages shows up repeatedly in the archaeological and historical record as a communal activity, tied to ritual, celebration, negotiation, and social bonding, rather than purely private, solitary consumption. Some researchers have argued that the mild shared intoxication produced by early fermented beverages may have functioned as a genuine social technology, lowering social inhibitions in group settings in ways that facilitated trust building, conflict resolution, and group cohesion among early human communities. If that argument holds, fermentation wasn't simply a food preservation technique or a pleasant recreational discovery. It may have functioned as one of the quiet infrastructural technologies underlying early human social organization itself, alongside language, shared fire, and cooperative food sharing. So here's where all of this actually lands. Nobody invented fermentation the way someone might invent a wheel or a bow. Fermentation was always already happening in every rotting piece of fruit, every forgotten container of honey water, every batch of grain left slightly too damp for slightly too long. What humans actually did was notice. Notice that the spoiled batch felt different than expected. Notice that it seemed safer to drink than the water sitting nearby. Notice that sharing it with other people seemed to make everyone a little more relaxed, a little more willing to trust each other, a little more likely to reach an agreement instead of a conflict. And then, having noticed all of that, humans did the thing humans are best at. They stopped leaving it to accident and started doing it on purpose, in Sumerian breweries paying construction workers and beer rations, in Egyptian industrial brewing facilities feeding the workforce that built the pyramids, in Chinese pottery vessels holding rice and honey wine 7,000 years before anyone wrote the word fermentation down in any language. An accident that kept happening, noticed by countless separate populations across countless separate centuries, until it stopped being an accident at all and became one of the oldest deliberate technologies our species ever developed, all because somewhere, a long time ago, someone tasted the spoiled fruit instead of throwing it away.